So what I wanted to do in this introductory little moment here was, first of all, give people right away an expressionist figure, since the title of the show is that. And you'll want to be able to talk about this Sheila, which is a very important piece in the collection from 1910. We put a little extra light on it, so I think it pops out from the wall a little bit. And I wrote about this piece because I think it's so extraordinary that he was able to do this at the age of 20 years old and was already, first of all, so accomplished a draftsman. He was apparently a prodigy in school and dropped out after a few years because he had absorbed everything they had to offer. This was done in 1910, as I said, when he was 20, and it's one of the earliest from his career that it is the earliest piece that Irwin collected from the Sheila's career. Sheila is his favorite artist, and so he was able to buy 3 different works by Sheila. The others are over on the other side of the gallery. But I wanted to feature this one because it is so charged, so emotionally strong, so indicative of how he was struggling, as young adults do, and very obsessed with his own ego, very obsessed with sexuality. And so this, I think, portrays that, almost like his skin is flayed off of his body, and he's exposed in a very vulnerable way to us as viewers. I think it's sort of the marquee moment for Expressionism, which Sheila really invented in the early teens of the 20th century, and of the show as a show about figurative art. These 2 works over here are also from the collection. One is an German expressionist, Christian Rolfs, and the other is a British artist, R.B. Kitaj. And we chose these because they're also sort of a mix of dates, a mix of styles, and a couple of female figures to go along with the male nude over here. Christian Rolfs is a German who was looking a lot at French art, as you can see. And R.B. Kitaj's work is a very much more modern piece. This is sort of a standard studio nude. This one is based on photographs taken by E.J. Bullock in the red light district in New Orleans, also in the 19-teens. And those photographs were lost for a long time and then rediscovered by Lee Friedlander, the photographer, who found the glass negatives somewhere, printed new prints from them, and those are what R.B. Kitaj has based his drawing on, a couple of those poses. So it's a figure study, but it's based on another artist's work, two other artists' works, really. And there's a little bit of collage here that indicates that she's a prostitute. It's a $20 bill torn off and stuck on her arm. So that's sort of a more postmodern approach to the nude. And then here is a work from the Walker collection, and there's another one behind you, the Pettibone. And that's another aspect of the show. In addition to the 79 framed works from the Kellen donation, I chose, I think, about 24 works from the Walker collection. Many of them are made by artists who are already in the Kellen collection, and some of them are not, but they came from purchases made by the curators using funds that were donated by the Kellens. So there's this thing called the Miriam and Irwin Kellen Acquisition Fund for Drawings. You see it on the line there. And that was something that they set up in the 90s, I think, or maybe late 80s, to allow the curators to purchase drawings for the collection. So it's another way of talking about their support for our collection of works on paper. It's also a nice way for curators to add some diversity to the collection of drawings. So you'll see throughout here I've chosen other works by women and people of color that have come in through that fund that expand the range of the drawing collection. So this work I added in, and also the de Kooning sculpture, which is made from a clay model. You can see if you go up to it, his fingerprints and just the evidence of his handling of the clay, which was then cast in pewter and made in an edition of 100 by Gemini GEL. And it's a sculpture, as you can see. I added, I think, 5 sculptures to the show so that we had some visual texture. They're objects, to break up long vistas in the show. So that's the first one here. So in other words, this is kind of a sampler for the rest of the exhibition, what people are going to see thematically and iconographically. Erwin had collected a couple of de Koonings, a couple of Mattas, and a Gorky, and a Klee. So there seemed to be a sort of critical mass of expressionism from mid-century by Americans and Europeans who were European immigrants. So I made this section of those. And you see two big Mattas in the back. The one on the left, we think of Matta, or I did anyway, as a mid-century sort of bridge between Surrealism in Europe and abstract expressionism in America. But this is a very much later piece, and it seems to have a different thematic basis. But you can see a mermaid in there, and some others. It's called The Fires of the Water. And some other, it looks like blue, water, rippling water. This is a piece that you might want to do some further research on or not, but it's a Matta, so it's in here next to his work from the 50s, which is called People Eating a Cat and Musicians. And you can see those elements in here when you come up and look at it closely. And this is very much akin to what Gorky was doing in the late 40s. Back here on the wall is a Gorky from Erwin's collection and one from the Walker collection. And I'll just point out too, in case you want to mention it, that many of the Walker works that I chose were also donated by former board members and longtime patrons of the Walker. So these are also gifts coming in from collectors locally. And this back here is another de Kooning from his period of residence on Long Island, when he did a lot of nautically and maritime themed work. It's called Woman in Rowboat. So you get various periods of de Kooning's work and various ways of approaching the figure, but always a female figure, from sculpture to drawing and otherwise. And then these are two Dubuffets, another mid-century European working in a different style, but also sort of, on the edge between abstraction and figuration. And as you know, Dubuffet was interested in children's art, graffiti, art by psychiatric patients, so-called outsider art of all kinds, and developed the term art brut, or raw art, for that kind of work, and tried to emulate that in his own work. So there's various kinds of approaches to the figure that have psychological undertones. And then over here, these are three really amazing surrealist drawings, and I put them here because of the relationship to abstract expressionism, because many of these artists were influential, especially Miro, for the Americans later on. So this is sort of all art historical right here, right? Miro, and I added in our Miro sculpture. Paul Klee, and this fabulous Magritte, which this is the frame that Erwin designed for this drawing. And it sort of brings the puzzle of the drawing out into our space as well, adding another layer of mystery about what's going on in that drawing. I realized that although this image seems to be reflecting somehow this woman who's holding the mirror, or maybe showing what the back of her might look like, it's really a different person. If you see her pose is not a reverse of the pose of the woman who's holding the mirror. So that's a really easy explanation for what you're looking at. But at first, it's very hard to sort of get your head around what is going on in there, because the hair matches up, the hair starts looking like a beard. There's all kinds of interesting things, very Magritte. But Erwin, this is one of his favorites, I think, in the collection, and he didn't always loan it out when he was asked, but it did appear in the big Magritte retrospective in Brussels. And he tells the story of going through that show, and he always plays a game of what would I take home if I could take anything home. And he said that going through the whole Magritte show, he finally decided this was the one he would have chosen anyway, when he already owned. And this becomes more of a sort of associative kind of hang back here. Because there are, groups of things that work together very easily, and then there are other things that were hard to fit in to any particular grouping. So these two are by the same artist, so that was pretty easy to figure out. Zach Smith is an LA-based artist, and his work draws a lot on graphic novels, cartoons, graffiti, that kind of thing. It's very colorful, as you see. He's very interested in Klimt, so you can see kind of a reference here in all this blocks of bright color in which the figure sort of blends into. This is a self-portrait of Zach in the train station cafe in Budapest where he was traveling. And he had somebody take a picture of the interior, or he did, and then he projected himself into it later on to make this drawing. And also this from the Girls in the Naked Girl Business series that Zach has done. And this one is called Amber. That's her name, I guess, or at least her stage name. And I think this is really interesting for a theme in the whole show, which is the models who pose for the artists who did all the drawings in here of female nudes. And when we go around the corner, you'll see the Degas, which is a standard, studio nude. The artist just hired someone to pose. She has no name. It's all about figure study. But all the models that he used would have been prostitutes because nobody else would undress, no other woman would undress in front of a man, not even her husband. And no female middle-class French women bathed, apparently. And this sounds weird, but I found this in several different books that I researched. They just didn't bathe. And so if any of those bathers that Degas drew would have been prostitutes, right? So you have a century apart, this very different approach on the artist's part and on the women's part to posing and owning their own sexuality, owning the power that they have over their bodies. And, she's a sex worker, and she is not ashamed of that. And she has a name, which, none of Degas' models have. So around this corner here is another very mixed group of things. This Jim Denomie work came in through the Kellen Endowed Fund, so I definitely wanted to include that. And he, as you know, is a local who has been having kind of a moment right now. He's just won the McKnight Distinguished Artist Award, and he's got some work in the São Paulo Biennale. And this I like a lot because it's a take on a classic piece from the canon by a white man, Wizard of Oz. I'm thinking of the book. And it's reinterpreted through the eyes of a Native American artist. And so here are these trees that in the movie, they had apples on them. And remember the apples, they try to pick the apples and the trees attack them. And here they become totems and witnesses to a lot of the violence that was happening in Standing Rock. Over here now, Irwin had collected a couple of still lifes, which aren't really figurative except in sort of indirectly, because somebody obviously arranges a still life and will probably come back and remove some of these objects and move them around again. So the figure is implied. And this artist, Daniel Massad, is only, what he does is still life. And it's very beautifully done as you go up to it and see the detail that's in this little group here of grapes and persimmons is amazing, especially when you realize that this is a pastel. This is also a still life that was set up by the artist in studio, and it's a watercolor. So these two works are just amazing in their technical accomplishment, because this doesn't look at all like a watercolor.
No,
if you've ever done a watercolor, you know there's a lot of wet and spreading, and watercolorists usually let the white of the paper show through, and etc. But this is done with an airbrush, which, according to Irwin, had a hypodermic needle on the end of it, so you could get just a couple of drops of paint out if you wanted to. And this artist also is known for still lifes, but usually they're more domestic arrangements of pottery and, furniture and doilies and such. But this was kind of a great one too, for just the mystery of what's going on, what's about to happen in there. And then behind Susan, there's the very first work that the Kellens ever purchased. It's called Children's Games. It's by a local artist who was teaching at Augsburg for many years. And that's got a very special place in his heart because it was the first drawing that they had been collecting other things, photographs or small paintings. But this was the one that really started him on the drawing focus. And this is Miriam's favorite work, the Saul Steinberg here. You know Saul Steinberg as an illustrator for New Yorker covers and lots of cartoons and such. And this one they bought at the old Dayton's Gallery 12, if anybody remembers that. It was on the 12th floor of Dayton's, and they had a very good gallery up there. And it's just a sort of generic or a combination, composite of the kinds of piazzas you see in Italy where there's a statue of King Umberto and lots of people standing around, gesticulating while they talk. So here in this room, this is more sort of thematically arranged, not really historically, but this is the room where most of the nudes ended up. It wasn't by design, but that's what happened as I started arranging. So on this side of the wall, there are classic mid-century modernist European works. This is the Degas I was mentioning, and two Picassos from the Kellen collection, the pastel and the drawing that's on the cover of the book. And this is another of the Rubin donation works that we had already in the collection. So there's a wall and Matisse. So a very classic wall. And just reminding now, looking at these frames, you see all kinds of frames throughout the show. These are the frames that they had on the works when they were in the Kellens' home. And we left them there because they give a little bit of sense of the domestic origins of the collection and a little bit of sense of the personality of the Kellens. It brings them into it a little more. Behind you, there's more of a mix of dates and styles. We have a Marlene Dumas on the corner here. It's called In Between the Acts, and this is from her Stripping Girls series. So this kind of all the same sort of approach as the Zach Smith girls in the naked girl business. So it's a more modern approach to the female nude by a female artist. So I think that's an interesting place to look as well. Then to Gaston Lachaise, French from the 20s and 30s. And I brought our sculpture out. We have that head sculpture in the collection. And then a Milton Avery, Richard Diebenkorn, which is an early Diebenkorn from probably late graduate school years when he was doing a lot of figurative work like this. And that is Kent Bellows. He's an artist you probably don't know. He's based in Omaha, but he's no longer living. But he was a really accomplished draftsman. This is a pastel also. So Irwin in his home had a room, it was his dining room, where that was, and also a couple of the other works that are what he would say, not what they seem. Things are not what they seem. You think it's a photograph, but it's really a pastel. You think it's a painting, but it's really a pastel. It's a watercolor that doesn't look like a watercolor. And there's one in here, photograph that looks like a drawing. So he had curated that little group in his dining room. This Christo, we know Christo as the artist who wrapped landscape features and big buildings and made the gates, Central Park. An early series of his was the Packed Girls series. And he was always interested in wrapping as a sculptural process. Early on, he started wrapping vessels, pots, various kinds of containers. And he had a show here in the 60s where he showed some wrapped packages on a wheelie dolly and other things. So wrapping was a thing that he always did. In the early 60s, he started wrapping nude women in plastic. Also kind of a moment for artists who were using nude women in their work as tools or as objects, like, Yves Klein with his brush women as paintbrushes. So in fact, the first wrapped girl that Christo did was done in Yves Klein's home. So this one was done here in Minneapolis, and it was a party. It was a Christmas party, and it was done in the home of a gallerist, Gordon Loxley. And he wrapped 2 women and placed them on a pedestal in the dining room. And this collage he made either after or before, I'm not really sure which, commemorating that event. And you know, Christo, he doesn't accept grants or money from anybody to do his work. He raises money by selling his drawings and collages. So this might have been done after the fact. I don't really know, but it's specifically titled Packed Girl Temporary Wrapping Project for Evening at Minneapolis. In this group, I put together 4 plus 1 works that are sort of fantasy, sexual violence, fantasy works involving nude women. Not really the de Kooning, that's just another version of de Kooning's women. It's an erased 2 torsos together, really fantastic drawing. But here you have a Bax Beckmann, German expressionist. And I don't think that's really a rape scene, but the woman who owned it and sold it to Irwin thought of it that way, and so she kept it hidden in a drawer in her house. And Irwin happened to discover that she owned it, and he bought it. It's the basis for a painting called The Town, and I think in the catalog there's a picture of that painting as well. He described the painting, the woman in the painting, as representing art, under attack from all of these creatures and various people around her. So that's a Beckmann. This is a George Grosz, also a very early drawing by Grosz, done in 1915, after he just got out of the war, and it's a very different George Grosz. You know, there's no context, there's no social critique happening in the drawing. It's just these 2 figures. It's called Temptation. And so I leave it to you to interpret this for yourself, but it's pretty great. I think it's pretty intense drawing. Then there's a similar piece here by Marlene Dumas, where the woman is being embraced by this sort of ghoul figure behind her. It's called Dreaming of Being Kissed Again. And again, you know, Marlene Dumas as a woman, she's depicting this scene, but not as George Grosz did, as an attack by a demon on a woman. But this is a woman's own sexual fantasy being depicted by that woman. And then this drawing here is by a Spanish artist, Gino Rubert. He was inspired by the photographs of a Japanese artist named Nobuyushi Araki, who's very well known for his very intense black and white photographs of models in poses of bondage and domination. And so he did a series of these inspired by those images. So these 3 walls here are sort of a group. And this is from more of the 60s and 70s American work that the Kellens had collected. And these mostly are non-figurative. These are a section for a while that I was working with was the implied figure or the fragmented figure. It's mostly implied here. So a lot of these depict tools or objects that people use. This Larry Rivers is a serial drawing of 6 different versions and views of the 100 franc note, French franc note, so it's money, right? And that fits into the theme as well of pop and consumer objects, etc. But this is used by people. There are 2 Warhol drawings, kind of classic images for him of the tomato ketchup, the Campbell soup can, and the before and after image. Do you know the before and after paintings of him? There is a series of 3 or 4, maybe 5 paintings from the early 60s where he uses 2 images he found from National Enquirer of a woman before and after her nose job. And this is a very different image. I don't know, nobody has figured out the source of this one, but it's the same idea. You've got a woman on the left who's, transformed and actually becomes like a younger woman. On the right, after her, whatever happens in here, the space, the empty space that contains the transformation. And that one, to me, it looks like maybe the cover of a tabloid that's stripped out of everything except the important information, which is the money and this little narrative down here. And I brought this Warhol box in to add to that. And then over here we've got some Oldenburgs, 3 Oldenburgs. 2 of them are Kellens, and this one is from Babe Davis. And that's called Giant Balloon in the Shape of a Screw, tip touching the ground. And this is a typewriter eraser. So again, 2 more tools, right? 2 more objects people use. And obviously the toilet is another one of those. And then Jasper Johns in the corner over there, which is more of an implied figure because there's an absence there. The leg and foot up in the upper left are drawn from a plaster cast that he had on a painting. This is called From According to What. There is a very important painting from Johns that's called According to What. And as he likes to do, he took details of that painting and made drawings of them. So this is one of them. And usually the details were places where there was a 3-dimensional object on the painting, which he's then converted back into 2 dimensions here. But in the painting, this is a plaster cast and a part of a chair that's attached onto the painting. So this is sort of an absence of that figure at 2 different levels. And then on the back wall, I brought in 2 Ray Johnson collages. These are from the collection. They were acquired at the time of a Ray Johnson show that we did in '78. And they're the same period. Ray Johnson is considered a sort of a pop artist, that's sort of on the side. He did male art. And also they have tools in them. There's this animal trap. And there's a chair here, upside down chair, which is kind of a nice rhyme for this. And I brought them in here because I thought they make a nice contrast graphically too with some of the work. So some of this was a visual decision on my part. There is a Rosemarie Trokel. This is one of the moments that is a little bit outside of the 60s, actually a lot. This is 2001. She's a German artist, mostly known for sculpture and video, but we had purchased this drawing from the Kellen Endowed Fund for the collection, and she's a woman, and I wanted to bring more women into the show, and work seemed to work really well here next to this drawing of the toilet, because you have a seated woman, you have a seat, you have this round shape. So this was just like a visual decision on my part. Actually, it was Kirk McCall's idea, put these together. It's one of our crew. Behind you there is the Zach Smith self-portrait that Irwin was looking for when he bought the other one as well. So the 2 self-portraits came in at the same time. And some of you might remember a Zach Smith wall installation of small drawings, like 6 by 8 pieces of paper that cover a whole wall. And they are 1 drawing for every page of Thomas Pynchon's novel, Gravity's Rainbow. So that work is already in the collection. I thought for a long time that this must be that he must be standing in front of that work, because it's called Self-Portrait with a Bunch of Pictures Pinned to the Wall. But he says it isn't. He says that these are just other abstract moments that he drew in. And then beside him, we've got 2 pairs here. Again, just a kind of iconographic decision to hang them together. These are these are all couples. So you have a Richard Lindner. And by the way, Richard Lindner's name is written on the chair in the Ray Johnson collage behind there, so that's kind of nice. This is a study for a painting. This is a Botero, dancing couple. This is the study for the John Curran painting that we have upstairs in the series show. And this is the photograph that looks like a drawing that Irwin had purchased and was in his dining room with the other things are not what they seem. Now we move into this kind of dark moment here in this corner. A little bit. This is one of 4 works in the show by this local artist, Rowan Polk, that some of you might have seen a show at the MIA that featured Rowan and his twin brother Bly. They're both artists. They both are working in pencil. This is a pencil. And very, very, very meticulously realistic approach to what they do. This one is based on the last scene in Franz Kafka's novel, The Trial, where the assassins take this poor man who's been trapped in this awful nightmare of bureaucracy that he can't figure out, and they assassinate him in a moonlit quarry. And Irwin saw this work, I think in the studio still, or in a graduate school exhibition or something, and was so blown away by it that he bought it. And he's been supporting Rowan's career by purchasing other things and recommending him to the curators at the MIA, and really being a great patron for this young artist. And I hung that next to these drawings by Carol Walker, also very intense, violent, but in a very different approach. These are, again, from the Kellen Endowed Fund purchases. Liz Armstrong bought them in 1995 or something like that, very early. And then behind you there is a big drawing by William Kentridge, which is something that Irwin made a big effort to get. He had to work pretty hard with the gallerist, and finally ended up visiting the artist in Johannesburg, where he lives. This is one of Kentridge's drawings that he makes for his stop-action animated films. So he'll make a drawing, erase it or alter it somehow, and do that over and over again, taking a photograph at each step, and then at the end of it, putting them all together into a film. And this is the very last scene in the film Sobriety, Obesity, and Growing Old. And there's a little bit of a description of what that film is about, but you can look it up too. It has everything to do with apartheid and the opposition of big industry, industrialism, and the poor people in the cities. And you can see a big group of protesters back here sort of approaching this scene. And this is just a Gormley that I picked out from the collection that I don't think has been shown before, which seemed to really fit into this section of this figure interacting with this large mass of black, sort of representing a psychology or psychologically dark moment. And Gormley's a sculptor mostly, but always makes drawings, and he's made a lot of drawings of this sort of stick figure and large areas of black interacting with him. These are three works by neo-expressionists from Austria and Germany: Arnulf Reiner, Günter Bruce, and Georg Boslitz. And then on this wall is, again, it's sort of another thematic moment here with these works. These are sort of historically based works around World War I and World War II. So this is George Grosz. This is a more typical Grosz, where he's doing a social critique on current events, where you have a French military officer and a German military officer making a deal. It's around a treaty. And then the poor common man, is being sort of overrun and sold out by the military. This is another of Rowan Polk pair here. This is the study that he put together for the drawing that he made below. And it's a kind of an interesting process that he does, because he makes a photo collage from found images that he gets off the internet here, and then he reproduces it in a drawing exactly. And it's kind of interesting. Like, I asked him, why would you do that? You've already got the image here. Why would you make a copy of it as a drawing? And he just talked about the beauty of the handmade, and how he just feels it's so special to make something by hand and drawing an original from going from digital to analog in that way. It's for him a really spiritual process. The other thing to think about here is going from left to right. He's left the drawing in various stages of finish. So over here, this is fully finished. In the middle is sort of halfway there, and over on this side, it's just basically sketched in. And you'll see that again back here. And this was done at Irwin's suggestion. He thought it was interesting for people to see how Rowan goes about doing his work, and how he moves from one stage to the next. And you can also see, I mean, I kind of see how he fixed this in a way. This photo collage is very dark, and you can see, if you look at it, the places where he stuck the images together. All that is smoothed out down here, and he's changed the relative light and dark areas so that it looks more believable almost than his photographic study. This is a Liberation of Buchenwald. And here are two works by a Dutch artist who only makes drawings of images, posters, graphics that were made before 1965, because that's the year he was born. And he's trying to create this encyclopedia of imagery that he could not ever have experienced himself firsthand when he was alive. So this is also a World War II image. Mussolini with his collaborators hanging from this structure in a piazza in Milan. And this is a strange ritual that happens on an island off of the coast of Denmark, in which these costumed men chase women and girls around the street after dark. It's a kind of, sort of like our Vulcans, and Winter Carnival Vulcans. It has that same feel. It's a ritual, but, you know, it's sort of dangerous at the same time. Then maybe just turn around here, we'll look quickly at the German Expressionism. This was another one that came together really easily because it's all historically related. And this is probably Irwin's favorite period in art history. It's the in between the wars, World War I, World War II, in Germany and Austria. So on this wall are three works from Brücke, which was a group based in Dresden and Berlin that really were interested in getting away from the artificiality of previous generation of German painters, the Impressionisms, and doing a more sort of art mixed with life approach. So they use their studios as their living quarters, their living rooms, their hanging out place. Their girlfriends and their wives would come in and model, strip. They had sex, they ate their meals, they slept. Everything was all mixed together in this space. And they felt that this was giving a more natural representation of what it was like to live. This one is of Kirchner's lover Dodo, and that was an example, I think, of the 15-minute nude. That was a process that they used in which the artist would wander around and look and see what was happening, what people were doing, if they're eating or sleeping or laying on a couch. And if they liked the pose that they saw, they would say freeze. And whoever was there, the woman usually, had to stop and let him draw for 15 minutes before she could move again. And I think that one was drawn in that way, because if you look at it, she looks like she's about to stand up, right? With her feet on the ground, her arms sort of pushing herself up, and she's giving him a look like, you know, a scowl. This one in the middle is a kind of classic Kirchner image of two women. It's called Two Girls Undressing, and you can see some of the furnishings in there. That stool on the right was an African stool that somebody gave him. You can see it in other images as how it's not clear there, but those two. And then one of the women has a sort of mask-like face that also speaks to Kirchner and the other Brücke artists' interest in art from the colonies. The German Empire had a lot of colonies in the South Pacific and in Africa, and they were constantly stealing things and bringing them back to museums in Dresden. There was a big museum there, ethnographic museum, that Kirchner spent a lot of time in. So his studio was full of this kind of material, and he hand-painted his drapes and carved his own sculptures to make it look like it was in this kind of quote-unquote primitive space. Otto Dix is Irwin's second favorite artist after Schiele. So he had collected 3 Otto Dix works. And they're kind of classic Otto Dix. Not as violent as a lot of the ones you would know about from Dix. And in fact, this one, I think of this one as being a really happy scene. Although some people really read this man as being animalistic. And he is kind of, but they're, she doesn't look afraid and they're having a good time with the wine. This is called Sailor and Girl, and it was made during a period when Dix was really romanticizing the life of the sailor. He spent some time in Hamburg, which was a big port, and came away with this idea that it was so great to go out on the sea and travel to all these exotic locations and have all kinds of erotic adventures in every port. And so he made a lot of sailor images at that period in the 20s. And then this is the wall of Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele. The other two Schieles are here that Irwin had collected, along with the nude in the front. And that's a nice range of dates from 1910. This is 1918 and 1915. So Schiele died in 1918, so that's the last year of his life. And you can see how confident this line is, almost even compared to this. It's just amazing. You can see where he started and sort of how he went through the drawing and ended up, I think, back here. You can almost see where he put the chalk or the crayon down on the paper. This one is a little bit more complicated. A lot, actually. You can't really even tell right at first where the two figures begin and end. They're so entwined. And then this one was already in the Walker collection, donated by a couple who had it and really didn't want to have it on the wall, so offered it to Martin. And he took it. Now, we didn't have a lot of company for this drawing, so it didn't get out very often. But now we have a nice grouping that we can probably put together more of a cohesive group of things. And Klimt here is here because, first of all, it's related. He was the mentor for Schiele, sort of took him under his wing, recommended him to patrons, etc. And this is a study that Irwin bought. It was in the collection of an Arab sheikh. He owned about 20 or 30 Klimt drawings, and they went up to auction. And this is the one that Irwin says he went to the auction, he held up his paddle, and he never ever took it down until he got the drawing. That's the only time he ever did that because he wanted it so much. And over here, I put two related drawings from the collection. This one is Sherrie Levine, and you know Sherrie Levine, she likes to appropriate work of canonical male artists. In this drawing, she took a reproduction in a catalog of Schiele's work and traced it exactly. It's not as confident a line drawing as Schiele would have made, but it's, the exact image. She didn't add his signature, but everything else is there. And then, it becomes this strange, ambiguous object. It's an original Levine that looks like an original Schiele. And this is by a young contemporary artist, Chloe Pina. And she's been very influenced by Schiele, both in her line, the style of her line, sort of, again, a contour, but also in the subject matter that she deals with, which is a lot of sexuality and death, sex and death, basically. And this is called homunc, means it's a homunculus. Homunculus is the construct from medieval times that every sperm had a fully formed adult in it. And you could grow these outside the womb in using special formulae and whatever they had, laboratories, whatever they called them. And that you could produce these fully formed humans, small, miniature, out of this formula. And so this is one of those. Seems to be deteriorating, but also maybe forming. So then there's one last area here. And this is another subject matter derived area. This is all portraits. And on this wall are a group of heads of various dates and artists. All of these are from the Kellen collection, except for the Elizabeth Peyton here in the middle, but these are various portraits. That's a Chuck Close. I guess you probably talked about Chuck Close and how to deal with Chuck Close. It's not a nude woman, but it is a Chuck Close. And this is a drawing by Brett Cook Disney, which is in the collection from the Kellen Fund, which is a portrait of Malcolm X with a camera, holding up a film camera. and a quote from one of his speeches on the bottom. And then these are 3 drawings that the Kellens had collected of 2 of Hockney's, where he depicts Henri Geldzahler, who was a friend of Hockney's. And then one by Larry Rivers, which is a portrait of Frank O'Hara, the poet, who was associated with the New York School. And here's another Rowan Polk. This is the 4th work of his. And this is one that he had started early on in 2008, when he was still working from single photographs. He doesn't do that anymore. He just works from collages. But this is a portrait of the father of a high school friend that he thought had a fascinating face because of all of the topography there and all the creases and pores and hairs. So he took a whole bunch of photographs of this man and then chose one of them to make a portrait from. And then he abandoned it before he finished it because he got tired of working from just one photograph, so it sat. It appeared in the Mia show, was less finished than this. And Irwin saw it and said, I'm buying that, but I want you to finish it more. So Rowan, again, he works from left to right, partly because he doesn't want his hand to smudge up what he's already done, and finished it completely over here, sort of in the middle, and then a little bit more here, and finally over here you've just got the grid and the outlines of where he would have put dark and light. So last 2 images here. This is the other William Kentridge self-portrait that Irwin was allowed to pick out of Kentridge's files when he was visiting him. Well, William Kentridge, he makes these stop-action animations. He also makes flip books. And a lot of them are featuring him walking through puddles, losing his hat, picking up his hat. And this is from one of those flip movies that he never finished or never put together as a book. And it's drawn on a page from a French encyclopedia. And it's called Hylocyanians because that's the first entry on this page. It's some kind of insect, class of moths or something. And you can see this kind of a relationship to that big drawing back there with the pool of water. That's sort of a symbol for purification. And then this is Marlene Dumas. This is the other frame that Irwin designed and had his framer make with this burled cherry, I think it is, back here. But the drawing itself is interesting. It's a topical theme. This is Marilyn Monroe. She's not named in the drawing, but that's who she is. She's being interrogated by 3 people. And it's a reference to Marilyn Monroe's husband, Arthur Miller's interrogation by the House on Un-American Activities Committee in the 50s, where they were looking for communist sympathizers. He refused to name his sympathizers, and she was told, if you don't make him cooperate, your career could be over. You'll never act again. But she stood her ground and did not reveal anything. But that's called Name No Names. And on the bottom it says, different version, blonde interrogation. Different version refers to the fact that she had made another one of these first as a gift for her husband. And Irwin saw it in a book and he said, I have to have it. And she wouldn't sell that first one, so she's made him another one, or she made another one, maybe not just for him, but he was able to get this one that he coveted, and this is one of his favorite works from the collection.